Margaret Jeter, and the Redcoats. Column Short Stories. By Faye Column Fairley. Many of our ancestors came to this country when it was still under the rule of the King of England. As our predecessors blazed out a trail in the early 1700s, they worked very hard to prepare a place to live, in addition to facing adversities of the era. Being unpopulated, the country held many obstacles. Wild animals, wild Indians, lack of food, and lack of shelter were a few of the horrendous trials they faced during that time. As if these were not enough complications, there were also people who practiced evil as their way of life. Stealing, killing, and robbing were quite prevalent during the early years. As all the newcomers built cabins, and became the early settlers, they also started forming alliances with those like-minded people who were seeking a peaceful life. My sixth great-grandparents lived in the middle of all this early uprising. William Jeter married Margaret Vaughan in 1741. They started a family in 1742. They originally came to Virginia, where they prospered greatly. Their older children stayed in Virginia, while William, Margaret, and the younger children moved to South Carolina. William had acquired much land, many slaves, and a great amount of gold. They battled insurmountable odds by today's standards, just to survive. Together with neighbors, they started a community. They built dwellings, places of worship, and places for barter. They trapped for food, and furs with which to barter for other supplies they needed. Salt from salt mines would preserve the meat. The water came from a nearby stream or creek. Before long, these early settlers had even created statehoods that would separate them from the uncharted wilderness. As the early settlers became more independent, the king started handing down acts to decree upon the people what he expected of them. All these acts decreed monumental taxes on the early settlers, which would eventually lead to being evicted from a home that they had suffered to gain. My paraphrasing may not be noteworthy in historical documents, but the reasons behind the Revolutionary War were real, and vastly important to the survival of our ancestors. A couple who lived near them had succumbed to some of the macabre challenges of the times, and both died. They had a small boy, who they left with William and Margaret Jeter. I could not find the name of this boy, or his family. He referred to William and Margaret as mother and father. I did find evidence that altogether, William and Margaret were parents to 16 children. None of these children listed were reported as being adopted, so my contention is that he is not listed in their children. According to my research, when the boy grew old enough to bear arms, he joined the American forces against the British. He soon learned that it would prove lucrative to sell himself to the British as a spy. He traveled easily in and out of his foster parents' house, and no one suspected he was a spy. It is merely conjecture on my part, but I believe the boy provided information to the British of the large amount of gold that William had. Without the boy's knowledge, William and his devoted slave Toby went out on the plantation at midnight, and secured a safe spot to bury the gold. One report said there were 7 kegs of the gold. Only the 2 of them knew its location. This leads me to believe that William knew the boy was a subject to the British. The Redcoats were seen several times, watching over the Jeter place. They were adamant that the gold would belong to the king, and no one else. One day a squad of the Redcoats came to the Jeter home to search for the gold. They pilfered through the entire dwelling, and all the structures on the plantation. They ripped apart all the beds, pillows, and quilts. When they found nothing of value, they seized Toby, the faithful slave, and with threats of torture and death, demanded to know where the gold was, and the location of his master, William Jeter. Toby did not know the whereabouts of William, and also denied knowing anything about the treasure. After his unyielding denial of the whereabouts of the gold or William Jeter, they built a fire, and placed his feet close enough to it until the bottom of his feet were baked. Despite the cruelty, Toby did not give in. The British soldiers left there with undeniable threats that they would be back, and would take possession of the gold. The young man, the spy, made another visit to Mother, and found out when Father would be returning. She told him, because she didn't know the danger ahead. His report was made to the British, as he promised. Upon William's arrival, he was captured in his home by the British soldiers. The boisterous threats of torture and death had no effect on the courageous American settler. They resorted to the torture by fire, like they did with poor Toby. They took him outside, built an apparatus for hanging over a big fire. They then proceeded to hang William bound hand and foot, to the limb over the blaze. When Margaret realized what the British soldiers were about to do, she was overtaken by an incredible possession of fury. She quickly grabbed a reed hook off the wall, and flew into the midst of the soldiers to defend her husband. Slashing and cutting without stopping, she had cut the soldiers' arms, legs, and uniforms. They were no longer just redcoats, but red all over with blood. Their retreat was fast as they could run, with the slashing hook still in pursuit. William was released from his bound position, and soon recovered completely from this ordeal. Margaret eventually settled down from her attack of adrenaline fury, and vowed to never forget this inhuman treatment of her husband and their faithful Toby. It was reported that a few days after the incident, Lord Cornwallis himself visited the Jeter home. Margaret saw him approaching, and met him at the door. He removed his hat, and bowing low, said, "My respects to the bravest woman I ever saw." With that, he extended his hand to her. She took a deliberate step back, and placed her hands behind her back saying, "My hands are for my friends, and not for robbers and murderers." Not showing any displeasure in her remark, he went on to say, "Had I an army of such soldiers as you, I had quelled this rebellion long since." With a look of defiance, she replied, "Then you would have the women to reckon with." Cornwallis then gave orders that this woman must never be molested or bothered in any way.